This video I'll show you how I adjusted the clutch pressure plate using a feeler gauge and a straight edge, which in my case just happens to be a Vernier dial. So if you watch the previous videos, the springs have been replaced and 3 of them have been added. So I have a total of 9 springs. I checked with compared this to other cars, and some of them did indeed have 9 springs, which is the case of the DeSoto. And there are the new springs now. Normally I've seen people adjusting the height of the levers. However, in my case, because somebody probably did this wrong before, I think that the bearing wore out one of the levers unevenly. So if I have all the levers at the same height, then the pressure plate itself is not parallel to the pressure plate disc is not parallel to the pressure plate housing, and therefore not to the flywheel. So I have to make sure, the most important thing is that this here goes flat and parallel to the flywheel. That's the most important. If the levers are a bit off, well, that's just tough luck. There is some free place, some room for adjustment in the bearing itself, but this here has to be parallel. So what I did is I just got the feeler gauge, or you could use any, you could use shims, like just pieces of sheet steel, and stack them together. But what I've did is I just happen to have the feeler gauge set here, so I got 2 feeler gauges here, and stack them like that, and then use the feeler gauge here to make sure we're 100% flat there. As you can see, there's no gap there. Then I did that for all 3 sides, and you have to do it twice, because sometimes when you tighten one side, it'll lift the other side up. So you have to do it at least 2 times, and then of course you either tighten or loosen the nuts here, the adjusting nuts, until you get the desired height. And so my next issue was that I'm not sure exactly how much distance we're supposed to have here. As you can see, I put the clutch disc flat there, as if it were on the flywheel, inside the bell housing on the flywheel, and we'd have that much space. So, and this much space happens to be about 6 millimeters, about 3/16. So apparently this is pretty much the correct height for most clutches, but what's going to happen is once I put these bolts on, the bolts are going to tighten this, thereby compressing the disc, connecting it to the flywheel. I got to make sure that I don't have too much force on these, otherwise they will break. The bolts could break off, so we definitely don't want that to happen. But anyways, that's how you adjust a clutch plate, pressure plate, and you have to obviously know your own specifications, and or just use common sense. You see, the height of the adjustment levers, it does not necessarily influence the force on the pressure plate to a certain extent. So let me explain. If I compress the springs more or tighten these nuts more, causing the clutch pressure disc to lift off more, sure, it will create more of a distance, more of a gap between the disc and the flywheel, but it will increase the force on the springs. So it's a two-way thing. You lose distance, but you increase force. So if I just tighten the way it is now, it's not going to change the force. It's going to change just the initial force. So the way it is now, the springs aren't compressed as far, so there's not so much force on the bolts yet. But once they're compressed, both ways would still have the same force. So let's say I removed a 1/16 off this distance here. That would increase the initial force, let's say by 500 pounds. However, at the end, regardless of which way I did it, if I just left it like this, or two, one, I could just leave it like this. Two, I could tighten the springs more, tighten the bolts more to lift the disc more, and that would increase the initial force. But at the end of the day, the distance traveled is just the clutch disc. It's just the disc. That's the amount of movement, extra movement you get. So at the end of the day, both of them, both ways, still have the same distance of flywheel to the. You still compress the springs by the same amount. What changes is the starting point. Okay, so why does that matter? What changes? What changes is the softness of the clutch. If I pull these springs up too much and they're too hard, then when I release the clutch, they're going to engage. It's going to be too aggressive. It's going to engage right away. Maybe that might not be so good. So we don't want. We want the springs to sort of increase their force gradually, whereas instead of just all at once. You want that plate to. Of course, if you leave it too soft, that will be bad as well. So there's a few variables here. It's not easy to explain, and it's a bit difficult to understand as well. But I mean, in most cases, you'll just get your specifications, or just go with something reasonable, and you'll be all right. At least I will be all right, because you guys probably shouldn't be doing this stuff, right?